The motion is, this House would condemn Britain's response to the refugee crisis. I look to Rosie Morgan, Jesus College, to open the case for the proposition.
In a recent BBC article, a man named Moaz from Ethiopia is being interviewed. "My wife and my baby drowned in front of me," he says, before explaining that at least 500 others died when a badly overcrowded wooden boat he was travelling on capsized. This tragedy occurred exactly a year after the worst recorded incident at sea since the refugee crisis began, where 700 people are believed to have drowned off the coast of Libya. We are currently facing the largest refugee crisis since World War II, and the UK is home to less than 1% of the world's refugees. I struggle to see how this is a response we can be proud of. Now, those of you that know me may know the Pope and I disagree on a lot of things, but when he said, "I dream of a Europe where being a migrant is not a crime," we couldn't have had a more similar position. The dehumanization and othering of refugees, the institutional lack of empathy, and the willingness of so many in our society to turn a blind eye, to see the crisis as someone else's problem, has created a response that we must condemn. But before I get to my main argument tonight, it falls on me to introduce my opposition. Speaking first, we have Dina Latif, a first-year history student at Oriel and a fellow member of Secretary's Committee. Dina is a generous friend and a very talented woman. I first met her doing VAC days, and I knew we were going to get along after we both went for the same tactic of making sure that everyone liked us by turning up on the first day with a lot of food. She's been published in The Guardian online and appeared on Channel 4. Describing herself as 50% of the black population at Oriel, I'm sure you all know what subject she was speaking on. Dina's friends often joke that they're not sure if she wants to be the Director General of the UN or a dictator. I'm honestly not sure which option they'd prefer. I did a little bit of Twitter stalking before tonight's event, and Dina's Twitter bio contains the gem, "Don't say you don't have enough time, you have exactly the same number of hours per day that were given to Helen Keller, Pasteur, Michelangelo, ... Dina, I hope you've used those hours today well to construct your argument for this evening. Next, we have Dr. Andrew Morrison. Dr. Morrison graduated with a medical degree from the University of Bristol before becoming a medical officer in the Royal Navy and completing a postgraduate diploma in public health at Hughes Hall, Cambridge, which we'll try not to hold against him. He was the MP for Westbury from 2001 to 2010, and in 2010 he was elected for the new seat of South West Wiltshire. I've had a little look at your Twitter too, and I particularly enjoyed the sassy tweet you sent Obama last week. I'm greatly looking forward to hearing your speech later on. And last but not least, we have Dr. Therese Kofi. Dr. Kofi studied at Somerville before completing a PhD in chemistry at UCL and has been the MP for Suffolk Coastal since 2010. Keeping on the Twitter theme, I had a little scroll through yours too. I was interested, if not a little surprised, to find out that you've been to 14 Muse concerts. Not a dissimilar number to the number of refugees some of our politicians might like to see accommodated in Britain. In all seriousness, I know. In all seriousness, I know how inspiring it is for many people here to see women from Oxford going into politics, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your speech later. These are your speakers, Mr. President, and they're most welcome. Hundreds of thousands of people are fleeing to Europe from across the Middle East, from places such as Aleppo in Syria and Mosul in Iraq. These are people looking for a safe place to raise their children, a safe place to care for their elderly and dying, a place to live where a knock on the door isn't a terrifying sound to hear. I will argue tonight that Britain's response to the refugee crisis must be condemned. It must be condemned because we have failed to do as much as we can to protect basic humanitarian rights. It must be condemned because we have not done enough to address the appalling conditions in which so many have been abandoned. It must be condemned because we have stepped back from taking into Britain our fair share of refugees. And above all, it must be condemned because in the face of an overwhelming humanitarian catastrophe, the policy underlining the government's response appears to be one of paying money so that other people can deal with the consequences of this crisis somewhere else, allowing us to outsource this issue in an entirely indefensible way. My opponents this evening tonight will try and tell you that Britain has done a lot to help with the refugee crisis. I just don't think this is the point. Surely the question is, have we done as much as we could have or should have done? To illustrate this, I'm going to put it in a European context for a moment. 1,255,600 people applied for asylum in the EU last year, which is more than double the 2014 figure, with most of these refugees being from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. A third of these applications were for asylum in Germany. In fact, there were 587 asylum applications for every 100,000 German citizens last year. Across the EU, the average number of applications per 100,000 citizens was 260. In the UK, that figure was 60. So this idea that we're being inundated with refugees is clearly just not true. According to the High Commission for Refugees at the UN, in mid-2015, there were 117,243 refugees, 37,829 pending asylum cases, and 16 stateless persons in the UK. Compare this, for example, to Turkey hosting 2.5 million migrants last year, and Germany registering 1.1 million refugees. An analysis of refugee figures from 2014 and 2015 indicates that we've fallen significantly short of doing our fair share. Based on the numbers I've just given, if we were to accommodate refugees by reference to relative population size, we should have taken 240,000 over 2014 and 2015. We took 70,000. No other European country in relative terms has been this unwelcoming. And so our approach is just to leave other countries to make up the difference. If this statistic wasn't bad enough, Britain actually accepted fewer refugees in 2014 and 2015 than in each of the previous 16 years, despite the number of refugees globally tripling. The UK cut the number of refugees it took by a fifth, while Germany took 5 times as many. This response, and in particular the prevalent attitudes that shape this response, is shameful and must be condemned. The government's acceptance of the new EU deal, allowing Greece to return to Turkey all new irregular migrants arriving after March the 20th, is also worrying. It's a deal the UNHCR has announced it considers to be unlawful, as it contravenes basic aspects of the 1951 Refugee Convention. It's also interesting to note that Bulgaria is the only country in Europe that considers Turkey a safe country to send people back to. And if sanctioning the return of refugees to an unsafe country in what's widely being considered an unsafe way wasn't bad enough, we can look at our treatment of refugees closer to home in Calais. The charity Help Refugees says there are currently 423 unaccompanied children in Calais. The youngest of them is 8. Many of these children have had a family member in the UK they've been trying to reach, and our border policies have meant that instead of being able to reunite with family, they're forced to live alone and unsupervised in atrocious conditions. And as if it couldn't get any worse, 129 children went missing in the destruction of part of the Calais jungle in March. Can you imagine what would happen if 129 children went missing in the UK? According to Europol, more than 10,000 unaccompanied child refugees have disappeared in Europe in the last 2 years. Our unwillingness to take in an appropriate number of refugees on a structured basis is contributing to this issue, and our apathy on it is condemnable. Now, I'm not saying that the government isn't doing anything to try and alleviate the situation, but I am saying that they're not doing enough. The government policy is to accept up to 20,000 refugees from Syria over the next 5 years. These refugees will be taken from UN camps close to the crisis in an attempt to reduce the demand for human traffickers to take people across borders. And I understand this approach. It is vital that we work to stop the flow of people travelling in unsafe ways, whilst lining the pockets of those profiting off humanitarian crisis. But this approach just isn't working. The International Organization for Migration says 120,369 migrants have arrived in Greece from Turkey so far this year, and at least 321 have died en route. More than 3,770 migrants were reported to have died trying to cross the Mediterranean in 2015, and more than 800 people died in the Aegean crossing from Turkey to Greece. According to the Missing Migrant Project, 1,357 are dead or missing in the Mediterranean this year. On their website, you can read every incident report, and it's a grim read, but it only gets worse. Just this week, the BBC reported that 1,200 refugees are in unmarked graves, as they just can't be identified. The latest wave of migrants crossing the Mediterranean surely is proof that the government strategy isn't working, and yet it appears determined to stick to it in such an inflexible way. No, thank you. If we look at the government's attitude to child refugees, we can see a government that consistently tried to reject the Dubs Amendment, refusing to take in additional child refugees until it became increasingly clear that they were going to face an embarrassing defeat in the House. Whilst this policy change is good news, the government's initial opposition to the proposals illustrate its true motivation, which is to keep our borders closed. The language used by government ministers is also illustrative of how they view the crisis. Our Prime Ministers refer to a swarm of refugees. The Defence Secretary talks of swamps of refugees and asks about how towns are under siege. Is it any wonder that people forget we're talking about individuals and their desperate struggle for life? I spoke earlier about how 1,357 people have died in the Mediterranean this year. The more we use language which dehumanises refugees, the further removed these individuals become from being people like us, and the easier it becomes to ignore their misery. Changing the vocabulary makes it easier to forget, when setting up barbed wire fences instead of sending aid, that people we are containing are just like us. If we want to consider what an adequate response would have been, perhaps we should start by agreeing to allow here a fairer proportion, a larger number of refugees. Based on relative population analysis, we should have accepted a further 170,000 refugees over the last 2 years, and we've accepted in real terms fewer refugees than Hungary, Sweden and Austria, all countries with a population of less than 10 million. Taking in a fairer proportion of refugees would be a good place to start. We should consider the extension of humanitarian visas in certain situations, so that people who would have their asylum applications accepted were they in the country have a chance to reach Britain. We should be more receptive to the Dublin regulation and have a more flexible approach in reuniting families. Almost all of you in this room would be too old to travel to meet a parent in a country where they'd gained asylum. Not allowing this is unreasonable, damaging, and frankly indefensible. If we were taking these steps and were clear and consistent in our approach, we could hope to make a real difference in tackling human trafficking. Instead, we're making a token effort while ignoring the reality of what we should be doing to help those in crisis. Of course, we must accept there are limits on what the UK can do. We can't possibly solve the refugee crisis alone, but we can and we should be playing a greater role. We cannot stick to a policy of 20,000 refugees over 5 years and otherwise focus on paying out cash, however large the sums may be, while thousands drown, whilst unaccompanied children sit in containment camps in Calais, while many of the most vulnerable people are deprived of any dignity and are the potential prey of traffickers. The Fortress Britain approach is a policy which lacks generosity, which is morally indefensible, and which ignores our history of being open and a home to the oppressed. Don't leave us in a position where we look back in 10, 15 years and we are horrified at our lack of action, empathy and compassion. Condemn Britain's response to this refugee crisis, and let's change it into one we can be proud of. Thank you.